Egalitarian rupture. This happens in a relationship that's highly close, very intimate and homogeneous, and also fairly equal. This describes a lot of intimate partnerships in the modern US, for example. The parties might not be perfectly similar, but they tend to have similar class backgrounds, similar levels of education, and so forth. Using any rough measure, you take them as another example of homogamy. They have a high degree of intimacy. They've probably been living together for about a year on average, in cases I've looked at. May have children together. They're romantically bonded. They live alone, away from family who might compete for their attention and time. And the internal dynamics of their relationship are fairly egalitarian. They might fight. They might even fight violently. But there's not a pattern of one-sided domination, one partner coercing the other violently, as one sometimes finds in domestic violence situations. I believe that these relationships account for a large proportion of suicides in modern America, and the large majority of those stemming from conflict. For example, the CDC estimates that problems with an intimate partner account for about 30% of suicides in 16 states they sampled. My study of South Metro, it was more like 17%, 20% if you add murder-suicides into the equation. A study of suicide in Britain, published after my dissertation, found about 50% of suicides involve some intimate partner conflict or problem. The trigger in these cases is usually some disruption to the relationship itself. It might be a pattern of escalating conflict in which the latest dispute is for some reason the final straw. The frequency with which the phrase history of marital problems appears in coroner's files is really staggering. Usually there's a long-term pattern of conflict, and then something that an outsider might view as a relatively trivial argument triggers the suicide. It's more explicable if we understand it in terms of this long period of moral distancing from one another. But perhaps the most common trigger for suicide in these relationships is what Black calls under-intimacy, some reduction in the closeness of the relationship. Now that can take various forms. One way of being inadequately intimate with one's partner is concealing things about oneself. Black calls this underexposure. One woman who committed suicide, for example, was extraordinarily upset that her husband had been lying about their financial situation, and in her note she chastises him, calls him delusional, and says that she should have been treated better than that. She did not deserve such shabby treatment. Another kind of reduction in closeness comes when someone establishes a competing relationship, especially a competing sexual relationship. And you see this in many cases. For example, one man who shot himself left a note saying, "This is my divorce from Debbie, cheating bitch. Now I don't have to look at it in my face." In another case, a 35-year-old woman caught her partner with another woman and then threatened to shoot herself, and he called her bluff by handing her a loaded gun, and she put it to her head and shot herself. Ben Fincham and colleagues relayed a case from Britain of a young man who came to his mother's house, quote, covered in blood, and said, "She's ripped my heart out, she's thrown it on the floor and she's bouncing on it." He was so upset, he kept saying, "She's shagging someone in the bed I paid for." Or there was the case of an African-American woman in my South Metro study who shot herself in the head as her boyfriend was removing his things from their house, which illustrates the greatest degree of rupture, when there's a complete termination of the relationship, divorce, separation, and so forth. One man called his recently estranged wife over the phone and asked her if she still wanted to get a divorce. She said yes. He shot himself while on the phone with her. The closeness of these relationships seems to mute the overt expression of moralism and condemnation. In many cases, you'll find that the person does express some degree of blame towards the other party, but also they express self-blame and say, "I wasn't good enough, this is my fault, the relationship ended." They mix self-blame with criticism of the other. Those who do take aggressive measures to try to guilt the other person, this is the main sanction they use, verbal aggression in the form of trying to guilt somebody or make them feel traumatized. A third configuration I want to consider here is what I'm calling patriarchal domination. These are relatively close relationships, closer than relationships with political conflicts, but they're also much more unequal than in the egalitarian pattern. This is best illustrated by marriages in highly patriarchal societies, such as various parts of Papua New Guinea, especially the highlands, parts of rural China, India, Iran, tribal Afghanistan, and other places. The structure of these relationships, it's relatively close. It's typically a marriage. They live together, they divide labor, they share sexual intercourse. But in many ways, they're more distant than the kind of partners one finds in the egalitarian pattern. They may be recently married, and it is likely an arranged marriage. They might not have had much close contact before, or a period of courtship and romantic bonding. Both were part of enduring corporate kinship groups, which means that for most of their lives they were enmeshed in an intimate group that was correspondingly distant from outsiders and viewed other families with some degree of suspicion, if not hostility. And in many of these settings, there's a relatively high degree of separation between male and female spheres. So the couple might only share limited interaction during the day, meals and sex and sleep. It can take intimacy a long time to develop in such relationships, and in many of the suicide cases I've seen, it occurs early in the relationship, when it's a new marriage. It's a highly stratified marriage. In these societies, the dominance of men over women is largely taken for granted. Often women cannot own much in the way of property. Property is either owned by males or by the corporate kinship group, typically headed by the eldest male. Women's sexuality is severely constrained, while men can have concubines, prostitutes, or second wives. Young girls are taught from an early age to defer to males, such as their brothers, and they're under the ultimate authority of their father until at such time they are married off and authority is vested in their husband. And often this authority is exercised through violent coercion. In these settings, you'll sometimes see even women agreeing that a man has a right to violently discipline his wife. Third parties also play a role in this subordination. In a common pattern, a woman leaves her kinship group and goes to live with the man's kinship group, surrounded by his kin and allies. She's also under their authority, the authority of her mother-in-law, the authority of her male in-laws. And this group might view her as an outsider, as a potentially bad investment. They paid bride price for her. They tend to be highly critical of her mistakes and take her husband's side in marital disputes. If she disobeys his authority, she might even be collectively punished. And you see this in some Highland New Guinea cases. One case from the Eastern Highlands involved a woman who fled her home, her marital home, and was caught and gang raped by her husband's family as a punishment for doing so. In these relationships, the common trigger for suicide, a common trigger, is overstratification, as Black calls it, in the form of some increase in violent domination. Women typically kill themselves because they've been beaten or insulted one too many times, they've been beaten unusually severely, or punished for something they don't think was an appropriate reason for punishing them, or punished in a way they find particularly humiliating. For example, Veronica Pearson and Ming Lu describe one case in, I believe it was a central eastern province of China, in which a woman was beaten by her husband publicly in front of the rest of the village, and this was the final straw for her, this added humiliation of having people witness this. For many, the greatest increase in domination comes early in the relationship. They've been subordinated all their lives, but that's been tempered by their closeness to their family. Now going into this new family, they're a marginal outsider, as well as being subordinated because of their sex. The family may have a case of buyer's remorse and criticize them and insult them more than they experienced at home. So for example, a study of suicide in Taiwan in the early to mid-20th century found that the age of first marriage is the age where women's suicide rates peaked, and female rates in that society at the time were higher than male rates. And one sees a similar pattern today in certain provinces of China, where suicide rates are higher in rural areas and higher among women and highest among young women at the age of first marriage. What's interesting is that when ethnographers and informants talk about this pattern of suicide, they often emphasize it's not merely a matter of escaping from an unpleasant situation, but also has a strong connotation of rebellion and revenge. That's because in many of these settings, the suicide will have negative consequences for the husband's family, and these are well known in advance. The women are in an odd structural location often. They have ties to a corporate kinship group that would tend to act as a strong supporter in a conflict, but the features of marriage stay their supporter's hand. Their family might not want to give back some bride price they received. They might not want to damage a political or business alliance of the other family. Or it just might be a matter of they're living at such a distance they can't be involved in her conflicts and take her side. She might not be allowed to see them on a regular basis. Yet if she kills herself, these impediments are taken off the table, and the family will treat her death in much the same way as a murder. They might demand compensation payments or take vengeance. And even if they do not, there might be supernatural curses associated with the suicide, or it might damage the marital family's reputation and their ability to find a replacement bride. Which is why you see women in these settings explicitly discussing suicide as a tactic of getting back at an abusive husband or in-laws. Dorothy Counts, once again, interviewed several women on the coast of New Britain, and common wisdom among these women was that fighting back is not the way. He's stronger than you. You fight back, he's just going to beat you up worse. You want to get back at him, you kill yourself. That'll make trouble for him. Of course, these three patterns don't exhaust all the possibilities of suicidal conflict, nor do these two variables exhaust even the structural variables one might consider when trying to explain suicidal conflict. So part of the trajectory of my research from dissertation up to present has been trying to expand this theory by moving out of pure suicide into other ways of handling conflicts, such as other forms of violence, homicide. Why kill yourself when you can kill the person who's pissing you off? My bridge in doing this has been patterns of suicidal aggression, such as suicide bombing, murder-suicides, and so forth. And just to give an example of a way I would try to further specify these structural relationships, this is an Afghan woman showing off her burn scars. In Afghanistan and increasingly rural Iran, women are turning to self-burning as a method of killing themselves in the course of these domestic disputes, consciously borrowing from the symbolic imagery of political protest in their method of suicide. Just to give two examples of trying to expand this theory and increase its precision so we can distinguish what structure leads to protest suicide, for example, versus any other way of handling an intercollective conflict. Because political domination leads to many things besides protest suicide. It leads to regular protest. It leads to guerrilla warfare and rebellion and terrorism. So I've recently written a piece on suicide attacks, focusing on suicide bombing. And I would argue that one difference, this is just one difference, in the structures of these two behaviors is that while they tend to both occur upwardly and across distances, the distance is relatively greater in cases of suicide attack, in cases of suicide bombing. For example, protest suicide is more often a domestic affair by citizens against their own government, versus suicide bombings tend to be more often international affairs. Notice I've made the two structures overlapping. There are certainly cases where you have relatively close bombings and relatively distant protest suicides, but I think they're centered over a different range of distance. And while you do find some protest suicides that cross cultural lines, such as by a Catholic majority or a Buddhist majority against a Catholic minority, it seems like suicide bombings tend to cross more and more distant cultural gaps, occurring more often between groups that lack the same nationality or the same ethnicity or the same religion, rather than just one difference. Likewise, I've been studying domestic homicides and homicide-suicides recently. And one idea I have about those is that there's a greater degree of distance involved in the typical homicide without suicide than if suicide also occurs. So I compared the average length of relationship in domestic homicides and homicide-suicides. They tend to arise over the same conflicts for the most part. Woman breaks up with man. Man either kills himself, kills her, or kills both of them. But the average age of the relationship was much higher in homicide-suicides than in domestic homicides that did not involve suicide, indicating that greater distance mitigated the possibility of suicide. Other directions for this research? Other forms of suicidal aggression, rampage killings, often have a suicidal component. Someone like the Virginia Tech shooter goes into the situation counting on either committing suicide at the end or being killed by cops in the course of their rampage. Suicide by cop, using aggression to provoke someone else into killing oneself. Where do these fall on the scale? What other variables make the difference? My ultimate goal, I think, would be to say why you have violence at all. Why not handle a conflict with nonviolence? Why do suicide or homicide or any kind of violent aggression? Hopefully I'll find the answers. Thank you.